Tom Hanks facing down possible Satan worshippers in suburbia? That's just the beginning of the bizarre story behind this cult classic. From death camp survivors playing Nazi-esque characters to skateboard moguls losing weight to land rolls, the making of The Burbs is almost as strange as the film itself. Did you know the movie's iconic street once housed the Munsters, or that its composer created musical dog barking for the score? Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about The Burbs. Fact 1. Tom Hanks was originally supposed to die. When screenwriter Dana Olson first penned the script for The Burbs, he had a much darker ending in mind than what audiences eventually saw in theaters. In the original version of the story, Ray Peterson wasn't just going to be proven wrong about his paranoid suspicions. He was going to pay for them with his life. The script called for Dr. Klopek to actually kill Ray at the end of the film, with Ray's body being driven away in an ambulance by the very neighbor he had been persecuting throughout the entire movie. It was meant to be a shocking twist ending in the style of The Twilight Zone, or an O. Henry short story, where the supposedly guilty party turns out to be truly guilty after all, and the hero doesn't make it out alive. Director Joe Dante was initially on board with this dark conclusion when he signed on to direct the film, which was originally titled Bay Window before it became The Burbs. He later recalled that he thought the ending was okay and fit with the overall tone of the script. However, everything changed once the studio decided they wanted Tom Hanks to play the lead role of Ray Peterson. Hanks had been identified as the most suitable actor to portray the married, conservative suburbanite who tries to inject some excitement into his mundane life by investigating his strange neighbors. But once Hanks was officially cast, the studio executives quickly put their foot down. According to Dante, the studio made it clear that they simply could not kill off Tom Hanks on screen. The director remembered the conversation changing dramatically, with producers saying they would have to completely rewrite the ending because you just couldn't kill Tom Hanks in a movie. This forced the filmmakers to rethink the entire conclusion of the film, ultimately leading to the ending audiences know today, where Ray survives his encounter with the Klopeks. The decision completely altered the film's tone, transforming it from a darker cautionary tale about suburban paranoia into a more audience-friendly comedy thriller, where the likable hero lives to see another day. Fact 2. Filmed during writers' strike chaos. The Burbs went into production under some of the most unusual circumstances in Hollywood history, and the timing couldn't have been more chaotic. Principal photography for the film began on May 19, 1988, which happened to be the exact same day that the Writers Guild of America strike officially went into effect. This wasn't a coincidence or bad luck. The movie was deliberately rushed into production specifically to avoid the strike, and the studio managed to squeeze in just before the deadline hit. Because of this timing, the entire production took place during the 6-month-long writers' strike, which meant that Universal Studios was essentially a ghost town during filming, with The Burbs and the Chevy Chase sequel, Fletch Lives, being the only 2 movies shooting on the lot at the time. The strike created some very strange rules that the production had to follow. Since no writers were allowed to work during the strike, absolutely no script changes could be made once filming started. This was particularly unusual because most movies go through constant rewrites and adjustments as scenes are filmed and problems are discovered. Director Joe Dante has talked about how challenging this was, especially since they shot the film in sequence from beginning to end, which is already an uncommon approach. If something wasn't working or an actor had an idea for a better line, they simply had to make it work within the existing script or improvise carefully around it. What makes this even weirder is that Dana Olson, the writer of The Burbs, actually appears in the film as one of the police officers at the end when the Klopek house explodes. But even though he was right there on set, watching his own script come to life, he was completely prohibited from contributing anything to the dialogue or making any changes. He couldn't suggest rewrites, couldn't fix lines that weren't working, and couldn't help solve any script problems that came up during filming. He was essentially there as an actor only, forced to stay silent about his own writing while the cameras rolled. Fact 3. Brother Theodore. Holocaust survivor. Playing Nazi-adjacent character. One of the most uncomfortable ironies in the making of the Burbs involves the casting of Brother Theodore as Uncle Reuben Klopek, the creepy, ghoulish older member of the mysterious family. Brother Theodore, whose real name was Theodore Gottlieb, was actually a Holocaust survivor who had been imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. In the film, his character Uncle Reuben has a distinctly Germanic and sinister quality that many viewers interpreted as having Nazi-like or fascist overtones, especially given the Klopek family's Eastern European origins and their portrayal as potentially evil cult members. The fact that a real death camp survivor was playing a character that evoked those very horrors creates a deeply unsettling layer to the production that most audiences never knew about. Brother Theodore had escaped Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, but not before experiencing unimaginable trauma. He lost most of his family in the camps and carried those scars throughout his life. After the war, he reinvented himself as a performer in America, becoming famous for his darkly pessimistic comedy and his memorable appearances on Late Night with David Letterman, where he would deliver nihilistic monologues in his thick German accent. His persona was essentially playing up his own darkness and trauma for entertainment, which made him perfect for the strange, unsettling role of Uncle Reuben. Director Joe Dante and the casting team clearly saw Brother Theodore's natural creepiness as ideal for the Burbs, and his performance is genuinely disturbing in the film. But knowing that he was a concentration camp survivor, playing a character with such dark Germanic overtones adds an extra dimension of tragedy and irony to his casting. Brother Theodore brought his real-life experience of horror to a role that was meant to evoke horror, creating one of the most bizarre and uncomfortable casting choices in 80s comedy history. Fact 4. Rick Dukemoon lost 200+ pounds for the role. Rick Dukemoon's transformation to play Art Weingartner stands as one of the most dramatic physical changes an actor has ever undergone for a comedy role. Before landing the part in The Burbs, Dukemoon weighed 426 pounds, and his size had become a genuine obstacle to his acting career. He had appeared in small parts in films like No Small Affair in 1984, but casting directors kept passing him over for larger roles because of his weight. Dukemoon realized that if he wanted to break through in Hollywood, something had to change. So he made the incredibly difficult decision to lose the weight. Over the course of approximately a year and a half, Dukemoon managed to drop more than 200 pounds, bringing his weight down to 216 pounds. This wasn't just a casual diet or a few months at the gym, it was a complete lifestyle transformation that required extraordinary dedication and willpower. The weight loss opened doors that had previously been closed to him, and when Joe Dante was casting The Burbs, Dukemoon was finally able to audition for and win the role of Art Weingartner, the nosy neighbor who becomes Tom Hanks' partner in suburban paranoia. What makes this story even more interesting is that Dukemoon wasn't just any struggling actor. He was already an established stand-up comedian with a growing reputation in the comedy world. He had performed on Star Search in 1984, where he finished second in the comedy category behind Brad Garrett, and HBO had even produced a special featuring his comedy in 1989 called Rick Dukemoon, Peace of Mind. Despite his success in stand-up, the film roles he wanted kept slipping away because of his physical appearance. His dramatic weight loss for The Burbs represented not just a career move, but a complete reinvention of himself as a performer, allowing him to finally showcase his comedic talents in a major studio film alongside one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Fact 5. Co-founder of legendary skateboard company Skull Skates. Most people watching The Burbs probably didn't realize that one of the film's stars had a whole other life as a skateboarding pioneer before he ever stepped in front of a camera. Rick Dukemoon, who played the paranoid and food-obsessed neighbor Art Weingartner, was actually the co-founder of Skull Skates, one of Canada's most legendary skateboard companies that's still around today. Back in 1978, Rick and his younger brother Peter Dukemoon started what was originally called Great North Country Skateboards, running the operation out of their parents' house in Nanaimo, British Columbia. Rick had been skating since the mid-1960s and was importing skateboard gear from California during his buying trips for a t-shirt company he operated. And the demand from Peter and their friends eventually grew so large, they decided to turn it into a real business. The company later changed its name to Skull Skates after customers kept addressing their letters to Skull Skates instead of the official name, all because of the distinctive skull logo that Peter had hand-carved into his grip tape. By the time The Burbs was filming in 1988, Skull Skates had become a major player in the skateboarding world, sponsoring legendary pros like Steve Olson and Christian Hosoi, and even cutting promotional deals with rock bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Rick had temporarily relocated to Los Angeles to pursue his acting and comedy career, which is how he ended up in the film, but the company remained a family operation with Peter still running things back in Vancouver. The filmmakers included a nice tribute to Rick's skateboarding roots by having one of Ricky Butler's friends wear a classic Skull Skates t-shirt in the movie, which you can spot if you're paying close attention during the scenes on Ricky's porch. Rick eventually stepped away from the day-to-day skateboard business as his Hollywood career took off, but his brother Peter kept Skull Skates going for decades, making it one of the oldest continuously operating skateboard companies in the world and a piece of Canadian skateboarding history that most Burbs fans never knew was connected to their favorite paranoid neighbor. Fact 6. Colonial Street is Wisteria Lane. If you've ever watched Desperate Housewives and thought the neighborhood looked strangely familiar, there's a good reason for that. The entire film, The Burbs, was shot on Universal Studios' Colonial Street backlot in Universal City, California, and that exact same street would later become the iconic Wisteria Lane, where all the drama unfolded in Desperate Housewives from 2004 to 2012. But the history of this famous street goes back much further than either of these productions, and it's been home to some of the most recognizable houses in television and film history for over 60 years. Colonial Street was originally created in 1950, and over the decades, production designers would move houses around, rebuild facades, and redesign the neighborhood depending on what each new show or movie needed. When Joe Dante needed a perfect suburban cul-de-sac for The Burbs in 1988, the studio completely overhauled Colonial Street to create the fictional Mayfield Place. They even had to remove the original Leave It to Beaver house to make room for the creepy Klopek residence, though a replica of the Beaver house was later rebuilt in 1997 for the Leave It to Beaver feature film. The street has an absolutely incredible Hollywood pedigree beyond just The Burbs and Desperate Housewives. The Munster mansion from the classic 1960s TV series, The Munsters, was built there in 1946 for the film So Goes My Love, and it's still standing on the lot today, though it's been heavily remodeled over the years. Other productions that filmed on Colonial Street include Dragnet, Back to the Future Part 2, Gremlins, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Murder, She Wrote, Casper, Beethoven, and dozens more. According to film location experts, the street is one of the most frequently used backlot sets in Hollywood history because it can be dressed up or down to represent almost any American suburban neighborhood. Universal Studios even includes Colonial Street as part of their famous studio tour, where visitors can see the houses in person and recognize them from countless movies and shows they've watched over the years. Fact 7. The Munsters house was deliberately hidden. If you look closely at Corey Feldman's house in The Burbs, you might notice something familiar about it, but the filmmakers didn't want you to figure it out too easily. Ricky Butler, the teenage character played by Feldman, actually lives in one of the most recognizable houses in television history, the Munster Mansion from the classic 1960s sitcom The Munsters. The gothic, spooky-looking house at 1313 Mockingbird Lane had been a fixture on Universal Studios' Colonial Street backlot for decades, and it was still standing when Joe Dante came to shoot The Burbs in 1988. However, Dante and his crew faced a unique challenge with this particular house. The Munster mansion was so iconic and so instantly recognizable to audiences that having it prominently featured in the movie would be incredibly distracting. Viewers would immediately think of Herman Munster and his family, instead of staying focused on the story of paranoid suburbanites investigating their creepy neighbors. The production team needed to use the existing houses on Colonial Street because they were working entirely on the Universal backlot, but they couldn't afford to have audiences pulled out of the movie by a sudden rush of Munsters nostalgia. The solution they came up with was clever and simple. Throughout the entire film, the Munster house is only ever shown in extreme close-up shots of the front porch. You never get a wide shot that would reveal the full Gothic architecture, the distinctive roofline, or the overall spooky Victorian design that made the house so memorable in the first place. The camera stays tight on Feldman and his friends as they sit on the porch watching the chaos unfold in the neighborhood, carefully avoiding any angles that would expose the house's true identity. This deliberate framing worked perfectly. Most viewers watching The Burbs in theaters had no idea they were looking at the Munster mansion, even though many of them had grown up watching that very house on television. It wasn't until years later, when fans started visiting the Universal Studios backlot tour and researching the film's production history, that this hidden detail became widely known. The house would later be heavily remodeled for desperate housewives, losing much of its original Munsters appearance in the process. Fact 8. Tom Hanks watched Mr. Rogers, then played him. In one of the quieter moments of The Burbs, Tom Hanks' character Ray Peterson sits in his living room and watches Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on television. A small detail that most viewers probably didn't think twice about when the film came out in 1989. It was just another ordinary moment in Ray's suburban life, the kind of background detail that helps establish the everyday reality of the neighborhood before things start getting weird. But looking back now, that brief scene has taken on an almost eerie significance, because 3 decades later, Tom Hanks would go on to portray Fred Rogers himself in the biographical film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which was released in 2019. The connection between these two moments is purely coincidental, of course, since nobody in 1989 could have predicted that Hanks would eventually be chosen to play the beloved children's television host. But it creates a strange, full-circle moment for fans of both films. In A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, Hanks delivered what many critics and audiences considered a pitch-perfect portrayal of Fred Rogers, capturing not just his distinctive speaking style and mannerisms, but also the genuine warmth and emotional depth that made Rogers such an iconic figure in American television history. To prepare for the role, Hanks reportedly watched hundreds of hours of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood footage and visited the Fred Rogers Center in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, to research the character. The film focused on Rogers' friendship with journalist Tom Junod, played by Matthew Rhys, and explored how Rogers impacted the lives of adults just as much as he influenced children. Hanks's performance earned widespread praise and several award nominations, cementing his transformation from the young comedic actor who once watched Mr. Rogers in The Burbs to the dramatic performer who brought Rogers' legacy to life on the big screen. It's one of those rare instances where a tiny throwaway detail in an old movie becomes unexpectedly meaningful years later, creating an accidental connection that nobody saw coming. Fact 9. Gremlins cereal Easter egg. If you look closely during one of the early breakfast scenes in The Burbs, you'll spot something unusual sitting on the kitchen counter in the background: a box of Gremlins cereal. This wasn't just a random prop choice, but rather a deliberate Easter egg that connects the film to director Joe Dante's previous work and creates a fun little piece of movie trivia that eagle-eyed viewers can catch on repeat viewings. The cereal box appears when Ray Peterson's son Dave, played by Corey Danziger, is eating breakfast at the kitchen table. While the scene focuses on the family's conversation, the Gremlins cereal box is clearly visible on the counter behind the actors. This playful nod references director Joe Dante's massive 1984 hit Gremlins, which had become a cultural phenomenon just a few years before The Burbs went into production. The connection runs even deeper because Corey Feldman, who plays the teenage neighbor Ricky Butler in The Burbs, also appeared in Gremlins as Pete Peltzer, the younger brother who helps care for the mischievous Mogwai. This kind of self-referential humor was typical of Joe Dante's directorial style, as he often included subtle callbacks and references to his other films throughout his work. The Gremlins cereal wasn't an actual product that you could buy in stores at the time. It was created specifically as a prop for The Burbs, making it a fictional product that referenced a real movie. Dante had a long-standing collaboration with composer Jerry Goldsmith and enjoyed working with many of the same actors across multiple projects, creating a kind of informal repertory company. By including the Gremlins cereal box, Dante was winking at his audience and rewarding fans who paid attention to the details, while also celebrating the success of his earlier monster comedy that had helped establish his reputation as a master of blending horror and humor in suburban settings. Fact 10. Jerry Goldsmith's score included recorded dog barking. When legendary composer Jerry Goldsmith sat down to create the musical score for The Burbs, he decided to do something that had probably never been done before in film music history. He actually programmed synthesizers to sound like a dog barking and incorporated those sounds directly into the orchestral arrangements. This wasn't just a random sound effect thrown in during post-production, but an actual musical instrument that played alongside the traditional orchestra, creating one of the most unusual and memorable scores of 1989. Goldsmith, who was already famous for composing iconic soundtracks like Alien and The Omen, had worked with director Joe Dante on several previous films, including Gremlins and Inner Space, and Dante always seemed to inspire Goldsmith to embrace his more experimental and playful side. For The Burbs, Goldsmith created what some critics have called a parody of his own work, written by himself, which is both genius and completely absurd at the same time. The score blends several wildly different musical styles to match the film's mix of suburban comedy and gothic horror. For the creepy Klopek family scenes, Goldsmith used a massive pipe organ that sounds like something straight out of a classic horror movie. But the most unusual element was definitely the synthesized dog barking that appears throughout the score, adding to the film's quirky and offbeat atmosphere. On top of that, Goldsmith decided to reference his own previous work by parodying the famous trumpet call to war from his Oscar-winning Patton score. He took those iconic triplet notes and ran them through an echoplex effect to create a comedic military theme for Bruce Dern's ex-soldier character, Mark Rumsfeld. The result was a musical joke that only someone as skilled as Goldsmith could pull off successfully. The complete score also featured recorded whale sounds in some cues, multiple layers of percussion instruments, and what one reviewer described as a musical firework of ideas. The soundtrack wasn't released until 3 years after the film came out in 1992, and it became one of the most sought-after and expensive Goldsmith albums throughout the 90s, with early copies selling out almost immediately. Fact 11. 3 different endings were shot. When director Joe Dante wrapped principal photography on The Burbs in 1988, he had a problem on his hands that would require some creative problem-solving. The film, that was supposed to be a darkly satirical look at suburban paranoia, had an ending that test audiences absolutely hated, and the studio needed something different fast. What followed was an unusual production scramble that resulted in 3 completely different versions of how the story would conclude, each one offering a radically different take on who the real villains of the story actually were. The original ending that Dante shot was far more cynical and critical of the main characters, essentially punishing Tom Hanks and his nosy neighbors for their paranoid behavior and assumptions about the Klopek family. In this version, the message was clear. The real monsters weren't the strange new neighbors, but rather the judgmental suburbanites who couldn't mind their own business. When preview audiences saw this darker conclusion, they rejected it completely, leaving the filmmakers scrambling to come up with alternatives that would satisfy viewers who had spent 90 minutes rooting for Tom Hanks's character. Adding to the complexity of reshooting was the fact that the film had been made during the Writers Guild strike, which meant that making significant script changes was extremely difficult and had to be improvised on the spot. Dante later recalled that they shot 3 different endings for the picture, and he didn't think any of them really worked perfectly, but they had to choose something. The alternate versions included different revelations about what was hidden in the trunk of the Klopek's car during the climactic scene. In some versions, the trunk contained the bodies of cheerleaders, while in another version, it was garbage men who had been murdered. Ultimately, the filmmakers settled on a version where the trunk simply contained a collection of bones, which struck a balance between confirming the Klopek's guilt while still maintaining some of the film's dark comedic tone. Fact 12. The Klopek actors didn't know if they were guilty. One of the strangest creative decisions made during the production of The Burbs was keeping the 3 actors who played the mysterious Klopek family completely in the dark about whether their characters were actually guilty of murder. Courtney Gaines, who played the youngest family member Hans Klopek, Henry Gibson, who portrayed the seemingly friendly but sinister Dr. Werner Klopek, and brother Theodore, who played the creepy Uncle Reuben Klopek, were never told if the Klopeks were really serial killers or just innocent, eccentric neighbors until filming was almost finished. Director Joe Dante made this unusual choice because he wanted the actors to maintain a sense of genuine ambiguity in their performances, keeping audiences guessing right alongside the paranoid suburban neighbors who were spying on them throughout the movie. According to Courtney Gaines in later interviews, this lack of information created a very unusual acting challenge because the 3 performers had to play their roles without knowing their characters' true motivations or whether the suspicion surrounding them was justified or completely unfounded. They were essentially playing the mystery itself rather than characters with clear objectives. This decision also meant that the Klopek actors had to carefully balance their performances between appearing genuinely suspicious and potentially innocent at the same time, never tipping the scales too far in either direction. The ambiguity extended beyond just the question of guilt as well, because there were also multiple versions of what would be revealed in the trunk of the Klopek's car at the end of the film, including alternate scenarios where the victims were cheerleaders or garbage men, instead of the collection of bones that made it into the final cut. This kept everyone on set uncertain about how the story would ultimately resolve, adding an extra layer of tension to the production that mirrored the paranoid atmosphere of the film itself. Fact 13. Tom Hanks and Rick Ducommun didn't get along behind the scenes of The Burbs. There was an interesting dynamic that most fans would never guess from watching the final film. Director Joe Dante later revealed that Tom Hanks and Rick Ducommun, who played best friends Ray Peterson and Art Weingartner on screen, actually had some tension between them during production. Despite their characters sharing some of the movie's funniest moments together, the 2 actors apparently didn't click off camera the way their suburban neighbors did in the story. What makes this particularly surprising is how natural and effortless their chemistry appears throughout the film. Art and Ray's friendship is one of the core relationships that drives the entire plot, with Art constantly showing up at Ray's house to eat his food, rope him into wild conspiracy theories, and drag him deeper into the investigation of the mysterious Klopek family. The scenes where they discover the femur bone in the backyard or break into Walter's house together are comedic gold, and you would never suspect there was any underlying friction between the performers. According to Dante's comments, Tom Hanks handled the situation with complete professionalism. Even though there was some personal tension, Hanks kept things loose and light on set, never letting any behind-the-scenes conflict affect the work or create a difficult atmosphere for the rest of the cast and crew. This speaks to Hanks's reputation even early in his career as someone who prioritized the production and his craft above any personal feelings. Rick Ducommun was a stand-up comedian who director Dante actively encouraged to improvise many of his lines to enhance Art's frantic, conspiracy-obsessed character. His lengthy monologue about Satanism in Ray's basement was almost entirely improvised, showing just how much creative freedom he had during filming. Meanwhile, Hanks was already establishing himself as a major comedic talent, having just finished big during the Burbs production. The fact that these two performers managed to create such memorable and believable moments together despite not getting along personally is a testament to both their abilities as actors and Hanks's commitment to maintaining a professional working environment. Fact 14. Bruce Dern accidentally destroyed the set. When Bruce Dern's character Mark Rumsfeld storms through the Klopek house during one of the film's most intense scenes, he reaches out and violently tears a huge strip of wallpaper right off the wall in a moment of aggressive investigation. What looks like a perfectly choreographed piece of physical comedy was actually a complete accident that happened during filming, and director Joe Dante loved it so much that he decided to keep it in the final cut of the movie. The original plan called for Dern to simply tug at the wallpaper a little bit, just enough to suggest that Rumsfeld was getting carried away in his search for evidence against the mysterious Klopek family. But Dern, who was known for his intense and physical acting style throughout his career, grabbed the wallpaper with much more force than anyone expected and ended up ripping a massive section completely off the wall in one aggressive motion. According to reports from the set, the moment happened so quickly that the crew was initially stunned, but Dante immediately recognized that the unplanned destruction was actually funnier and more fitting for the increasingly unhinged behavior of the neighborhood vigilantes than what they had originally scripted. The accidental wallpaper destruction perfectly captured the escalating chaos of the scene, where the supposedly normal suburban neighbors have completely abandoned any sense of boundaries or restraint in their obsessive investigation of their new neighbors. Dern's over-the-top physical moment became one of the many memorable touches in a film that thrived on pushing suburban paranoia to absurd extremes. The fact that it was a genuine mistake that made it into the movie adds another layer to the film's legacy of happy accidents and improvisation, showing how sometimes the best moments in filmmaking come from unexpected mistakes rather than careful planning. This wasn't the only instance of spontaneous creativity on the set of The Burbs, as director Dante encouraged his actors to experiment and try different approaches to their scenes, creating an environment where accidents like Dern's wallpaper rampage could become comedy gold. Fact 15. Lionel Richie randomly visited the set. One of the strangest moments during the production of The Burbs had nothing to do with the cast or crew, and everything to do with an unexpected visitor who showed up out of nowhere. One day during filming in 1988, the production office received a phone call from none other than pop superstar Lionel Richie, who at the time was one of the biggest names in music. Richie had just come off a string of massive hits, including Hello and All Night Long, and he was at the absolute peak of his fame. But instead of being surrounded by screaming fans or working on his next album, Richie had a very specific and unusual request. He wanted to come by the set of The Burbs and simply observe the filming. According to publicist Reed Roosevelt, who worked on the film, Richie called and politely asked if he could visit the set to watch them work. Roosevelt had to check with director Joe Dante and the cast first to make sure everyone was comfortable with having a celebrity visitor, and Tom Hanks apparently responded by saying yes, but also asking, "But Reed, why?" Nobody could figure out why Lionel Richie would want to spend his evening watching a suburban horror comedy being filmed on the Universal backlot. But Richie did indeed show up that night exactly as promised. He arrived quietly, observed the night's filming without causing any disruption, and then left just as mysteriously as he had arrived. He never explained his reasons for being there, and he never asked for special treatment or attention from anyone on set. Years later, Roosevelt reflected on the bizarre visit and came to his own conclusion about what might have been going on. He suspected that Richie was visiting multiple sets around Universal at that time, possibly researching or getting a feel for movie production because he was considering some kind of project of his own. But even that was just speculation. To this day, nobody involved with the Burbs really knows why Lionel Richie wanted to be there that night, making it one of the most random and unexplained celebrity encounters in the film's production history.